They told me the morning of the autumn trials that a woman had been entered by the Guildmaster of Makers as a formality, a placeholder, a body in the last station to fill the required count of 12. I had heard this story before. In Valdres the trials were old, older than my father's reign, older than the stone arches of the proving ground itself, and in all the years I had sat the dais and watched them, I had learned that the word formality was the cruelest word in the kingdom. It meant, we have entered someone we do not expect to survive the morning. It meant, watch and do not be surprised when she is asked to leave. I settled into my chair at the center of the high dais and looked out over the arena. Torchlight still burned in the brackets along the outer walls, though the sun had climbed above the eastern arch. The proving ground smelled of cold stone and the particular sharpness of autumn air, a smell I associated with judgment, with the long silence before a verdict, with the way a crowd holds its breath and then exhales into contempt or into awe. I had smelled both in this arena more times than I could count. The 12 stations were arranged in a wide crescent below the dais, long worktables of pale stone, each fitted with the tools of the Makers' Guild. Hammers and gauges and fine-edged blades. Lengths of material to be worked, hide metal, the close grain wood the guild called heartwood, and the pale clay that came down from the northern quarries. Each competitor would be assigned a station by lot and given the same window of time. The judges, 3 guild elders seated to my left, would assess the work at the close. I watched the competitors file in, 10 men of various ages and pack ranks. One woman near the middle of the line, tall and composed, who I recognized as the daughter of a merchant family with a long record in the guild. She had competed 3 times before and placed well. I expected her to place well again. And then last through the arch, the 12th. She was small, not fragile. I revised that impression almost immediately, because there was nothing fragile in the way she walked, but slight, and dressed plainly, in the pale gray that unmarked guild entrants wore when they had no house colors to show. Her hair was dark and pulled back. Her hands, I noticed even at that distance, were ink-stained at the knuckles, or perhaps chalk. Some fine, pale dust that had worked itself into the creases of her skin. She did not look at the crowd. The tiers above the arena floor held perhaps 300 wolves, Valdres's guild families, the packs ranked households, the observers who came every autumn to watch the trials and confirm their sense of the world's order. They were already murmuring. I heard it from the dais, a low, contemptuous sound, the kind a crowd makes when it has already decided. She was the joke entry, the placeholder, the name entered to fill the count. She found her station, the last in the crescent, the one furthest from the dais and closest to the wall, where the torchlight did not reach well, and she set down the small cloth bag she carried. She did not look up at the crowd. She did not look at the other competitors. She looked at the table. Something in my chest moved. I did not know what to call it. I had sat this dais for 16 years. I had watched hundreds of trials, not only the makers, but the hunters, the healers, the scribes. I had learned to feel the room, the energy of competition, the sharp particular tension before a great performance, the flat, dull weight of an afternoon when no one surprised you. I knew those feelings well. This was not any of them. It was quieter than all of them. A stillness behind the ribs, as if something in me had been waiting a long time and had just not arrived exactly. Noticed, as if a door I had not known was closed had shifted, almost imperceptibly, on its hinges. I set it aside. The lot was drawn, stations were confirmed, the trial master raised the counting flag. The morning began. The Makers' trial ran to midday. 4 hours, by the great stone clock set into the eastern wall of the arena. In that time, each competitor was to produce a finished work, one complete piece from the materials at their station. The judges would assess on 3 measures: precision, originality, and what the guild elders called hand-truth. The quality that could not be taught, only recognized. The mark of a maker whose hands understood the material in ways that could not be reduced to method. I watched all of them, as was my duty. And they were good, several of them genuinely good, the kind of work that made me understand why this kingdom still produced things the southern packs came to buy. The merchant's daughter worked with a control and economy I admired. The eldest of the men, gray-bearded, unhurried, produced a carved piece in heartwood that had a weight and gravity to it, a sense of time pressed into form. And then there was the 12th station. I had glanced at her several times in the first hour, out of something I did not yet name. She had not yet begun to work. She stood at her table, looking at the materials. The guild had assigned her the hardest lot, I noticed, the combination of metals and close-grain wood and the fine pale clay that required the most difficult technique to work together. A deliberate humiliation. No one entering a trial on a placeholder entry could be expected to manage all three materials. You would typically choose one and leave the others untouched. If you tried to work all three and failed, you would be scored lower than if you had stayed with one. She was looking at all three. The guild elder on my left, Harwick, the oldest of the judges, who had served the trials since before my father's time, leaned toward me and said very quietly, "She'll leave the medals. She doesn't have the training." I said nothing. She reached into her cloth bag and removed a small wrapped tool. She unwrapped it at the edge of the table. I could not see the detail from the dais, but the motion was particular, careful, the way you handle something you have made yourself and know in your hands the way you know your own heartbeat. She set it beside the others. She looked at the materials for another moment. Then she began. I cannot tell you exactly when I stopped watching the other stations. I am aware that it happened, that at some point in the second hour my attention did not move away from the last position in the crescent, no matter how deliberately I tried to distribute it. I was the Alpha King of Valdris. I had obligations of fairness, of attention, of ceremony. I looked at the other stations. I noted what was being produced, and then I looked back. Her hands moved differently from the others. That is the only way I can describe it, and I know it is not adequate. But every other maker in the arena worked the way trained makers work, with visible intention, with the incremental steps of technique, with the pauses and assessments that show a craftsman checking their progress against a plan. You could follow their thinking. You could see the decisions being made. She did not work that way. She worked as if the thing she was making already existed, and she was simply finding it. As if the metal and the wood and the pale clay had a shape they were meant to be, and her hands already knew what it was, and the tools were only the means of clearing away the distance between what was there and what should be. I had seen makers of great skill. I had watched the guild masters work, in demonstration and in private, over the course of 16 years. I had seen precision, and I had seen artistry, and I had seen the rarer quality that the elders called hand-truth. I had never seen this. The stillness behind my ribs deepened. It was not dramatic. There was no flood of recognition, no sudden blaze, nothing that I could have pointed to and named in that moment as something outside the ordinary. It was more like weather shifting, the pressure in a room before rain, the way the air changes before something arrives that you had not known was coming. A warmth that had no source I could identify, a recognition that was not yet knowledge. In the tiers, the crowd was growing restless. The competitors at the nearer stations were finishing or clearly in their final stages, and the noise of the audience had turned the way it does when the outcome feels decided. A hum of anticipation, of the particular pleasure of confirmation. The merchant's daughter was drawing attention. Two of the men were producing work that the crowd could see and appreciate from the tiers. No one was watching the 12th station. At the third hour, Harwick said to me, "She's still working the clay. She'll run short." I did not answer. I was watching her hands. What I remember of that third hour, the light changing as the sun climbed fully over the eastern arch and came down into the arena at a lower angle, the torch brackets dimming in the increased daylight, the particular silence that had begun to settle around the last station, not the silence of inattention, but the silence of people who have noticed something and are not yet sure what to do with it. It started with the competitors nearest her. One of the men, stationed 2 positions up the crescent, had finished his own work and stepped back to assess it, the way makers do in the final stage. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked sideways. I saw his posture change. He looked once and then looked away and then looked back, and I knew that quality of attention, the involuntary return, the eyes going somewhere because they could not help it. Then a woman in the lower tiers directly above the 12th station stopped speaking to the person beside her. Then another. The crowd's noise did not stop all at once. It thinned the way a river thins into a delta, dispersing into smaller and smaller channels until what is left is not quite silence and not quite sound. The held breath of 300 people, none of whom would have admitted they were holding it. Harwick beside me went still. I had not moved. I do not think I moved for the better part of that third hour. I sat in the high chair at the center of the dais, and I watched, and the stillness behind my ribs was no longer quiet and no longer small. She was finishing. What she had made, I could not see it clearly from the dais, but I could see its outlines. She had worked all three materials as I had thought she might. The metal and the heartwood and the pale clay, all three together, joined in a way that should not have been possible in 4 hours of trial time. The pieces were separate tasks, each requiring different tools, different technique, different attention. The guild assigned them together to the hardest stations precisely because working all three meant working each one less. You sacrificed depth for breadth. You produced 3 competent things rather than 1 excellent thing. She had not done that. I could not see the fine detail of what she had made, but I could see its quality in the way the others were responding to it. The competitor 2 stations up, who had produced a handsome piece of his own and knew it, was looking at the 12th station with an expression that was not quite envy and not quite awe and was entirely beyond his control. The crowd had redistributed itself. People who had been seated above the nearer stations were moving or leaning or standing, trying to see. The guild masters in the front tier, the 3 men who had entered her as a formality, were not moving. They sat with the particular stillness of people who have understood something they did not want to understand. The counting flag dropped. The trial master called the close. She stepped back from her table. The bond, if that is what the stillness had been, the pressure and the warmth and the recognition that had no name yet, the bond became something I could no longer pretend was ambiguous. It was not a physical sensation, or not only. It was more accurate to say that something in me that had been oriented in no particular direction for 42 years oriented itself, clearly and finally and without hesitation, toward the last station in the crescent and the woman standing at it. And I understood in the same instant that this orientation was not new. It had been there since she walked through the arch. I had felt it the moment she set down her cloth bag and looked at the table, that shift on the hinges, that stillness, that door that had seemed closed, and now seemed to have been open all along. Only I had not known what I was looking at. I rose from my chair. Harwick said, "My king, the judges have not yet." I said, "I see that." I walked to the edge of the dais. The arena floor was reached by a short flight of stone steps at the dais's center. I had walked down them 16 times, once each autumn, to deliver the formal acknowledgement at the trial's close, a brief address to the competitors, a confirmation that the judge's assessment would be delivered within the hour. It was ceremony. It meant nothing beyond its form. I walked down the steps and past the formal center of the arena and did not stop there. I walked to the 12th station. Behind me, I heard the crowd. Not sound exactly, a shift in the held breath, a new quality to the silence, the particular attention of 300 people who have just recalculated the significance of what they are watching. She did not look up when I stopped at the table. She was looking at what she had made, the way a maker looks when the work is done, and you are no longer inside it, and you can finally see it clearly. Her hands, ink-stained and chalk-dusted, were still. I looked at the table. I had not known what to expect, even from the dais. What I saw was, I will not strain the description. I will tell you only what it was, and let the truth of it stand without embellishment. She had made 3 things that were one thing. In the center of the table, a small vessel, no larger than 2 hands cupped together, of pale clay worked so thin it was nearly translucent. The kind of thinness that took years of technique to achieve without the clay collapsing, and that she had achieved in 4 hours on the hardest station with the worst allotment of tools. Set into its wall at intervals were thin bands of the metal, beaten and curved and fitted into the clay in a way that had no gap, no seam, no evidence of joining, as if the metal had grown there, as if the clay had known when it was formed that the metal was coming and had made room. And the lid, a fitted piece of heartwood, carved with a figure I could not fully read in the dim light, sealed to the clay lip with a precision that should have been impossible, the organic grain of the wood meeting the pale, artificial surface of the clay as though they had been made for each other before either material had been touched. The thing was closed. I did not know what was inside it, if anything. It did not matter. What mattered was the quality that the elders called hand-truth, the mark of a maker whose hands understood the material in ways that could not be reduced to method. In 42 years of Valdris, in 16 years of trials, I had seen it perhaps 3 times. Once in a weapon made by my father's smith. Once in a piece of architecture that stopped me on a street in the lower city and would not let me walk past. Once in a song, which is a different kind of making but the same kind of truth. I had never seen it in one piece that encompassed 3 materials and required 3 separate disciplines, and had been produced in 4 hours by a woman entered in the trial as a placeholder. I looked at the work for a long moment. Then I looked at her. She met my eyes. Her expression was composed, not defiant, not frightened, not performing composure. Actually composed in the way of someone who has done what they set out to do and is prepared for whatever comes next, good or bad. Her eyes were dark. In the poor torchlight of the 12th station, I could see that she was younger than I had taken her for from the dais. Not a girl, but younger than the gray at my temples, younger than the weight I had carried in this kingdom for 16 years. She looked at me with the directness of someone who is not asking anything and is also not pretending not to want anything. I said quietly enough that only she would hear for the moment, "How long have you made things like this?" She said, "Since I was 7. "And who trained you?" "No one." I turned then to face the arena, the judges on my left, the guild masters in the front tier, the 300 wolves in the tiers above them, the 12 competitors strung across the crescent of the arena, and the work on each of their tables. I did not use my formal address voice. I did not need to. The arena was as quiet as I had ever heard it, and whatever I said in a normal voice would carry. I said, "The trial is concluded. The work at Station 12 is not to be assessed by the guild's standard measures." I paused, because there is no measure for it. In the front tier, the eldest guild master, the one who had entered her as a formality, as a placeholder, as a body to fill the count, went the particular color of a man who understands that he has just been made to answer for something. He did not speak. I said, "The guildmaster entered this woman as the 12th entrant with the expectation that she would not complete the trial. She has not only completed it, she has produced the finest piece of work this arena has seen in my reign." A sound in the tiers, not the contemptuous murmur of before, but something different, something that had no single name, the sound of a crowd in the act of revising. I turned back to the table, to her. The warmth behind my ribs was no longer a stillness. It was a current, steady and particular and entirely certain, the way a river knows its direction without deciding, without trying. I had heard the elders describe the mate bond in those terms, not a lightning strike, not a sudden conflagration, but a river finding its course. The certainty of water going where it has always been going. I said to her at the same volume, quiet for her, though the arena heard, "I am going to tell you something that you may find unexpected, and I want you to know that you are free to respond however you choose. Whatever you say, nothing that has just happened here will be taken from you." She looked at me steadily. I said, "You are my fated mate." A long silence. She said, "I know." I had not expected that. Whatever I had prepared myself to say in the next moment, some careful, gentle elaboration, some acknowledgement of how strange this was, some offer of space and time, I had not prepared for that. The simplicity of it, I know. I said, "For how long?" She said, "Since you walked down the steps." "And before that?" Her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more interior than that. She said, "I felt something change when I walked through the arch. I thought it might be nerves." "And then?" "And then you came down the steps," she said, "and I was not nervous anymore." I had been Alpha King of Valdris for 16 years. I had governed a kingdom, mediated disputes between pack houses that had nursed grievances for generations, sat in judgment in this very arena on matters of life and livelihood. I had been, in all of that, careful with words, precise, measured, deliberate. My father had taught me that a king's words carried the weight of authority and should not be spent carelessly. I found, standing at the 12th station in the autumn light, that I did not have a great many words available to me. I said, "Will you let me show you something?" She looked at me with that direct, waiting expression. "Yes." I lifted my right hand, palm out, the inside of the wrist toward her, and there in the old script of Valdris, barely visible against the skin in the low light, the mark, not the formal mark of the Alpha King, which was a public thing, pressed into wax and worn on the ring. This was the other one, the one the bond leaves when it finds its answer. I had carried it for 42 years. It had been there since my birth. The healers said, the sign of a king for whom the mate bond would be strong, the mark that indicated a fated match rather than a chosen one. In all the years of my reign, I had not found its answer. I had stopped looking after a time. I had decided, with the practical resignation of a man past 40, that perhaps some marks did not find their match in a single lifetime. That perhaps the next Alpha King would carry it forward, whatever it meant. She looked at the mark, and then she extended her own hand, her left, the ink-stained one, and turned it palm up. On the inside of her wrist, in the same old script, the same mark, the other half of the bond written in the same hand. I had never seen both halves together. I had not known what it would look like when both were visible at once. What I can tell you is this: they recognized each other. I do not know a better way to say it. The two marks, separated by perhaps a hand's width of air, seemed to become aware of each other in the way that two things in proximity become aware. A warmth, a settling, a sense of completion that was not dramatic and was not small. The current behind my ribs became a steadiness. Not urgency, but certainty. Not arrival, but continuation, as if something had been going on for a long time, quietly, and had now been confirmed. In the arena above and around us, the sound of the crowd had changed again. Not silence this time, something more tentative than that, the sound of people witnessing something they had not expected to witness. 300 wolves in the tiered seats of the proving ground, looking down at the last station in the crescent. At the Alpha King, and the woman entered as a placeholder. And in the front tier, the guild masters, 3 men who had arranged a humiliation, who had assigned the worst station, the hardest materials, the poorest tools, who had entered a name in the rolls as a formality, as a joke, as confirmation that the world was ordered in a way that kept certain hands from being seen. They were very still now. The eldest had both hands pressed flat on his knees. His face had the look of a man reckoning with what he has thrown away. I looked at her. "You will have to forgive me," I said. "I have 16 years of ceremony ahead of me, and very little of it prepared me for this particular moment." The not-quite smile again. "I've had about 45 minutes, she said. "I'm also not prepared." "Then we are equally unready," I said, "and I find that appropriate." I reached into the fold of my cloak, the formal one, the gray and black of the Alpha King of Valdris, the one that carried the weight of the office in its very weave, and I drew it off my shoulders. An old gesture. Older than the trials, older than the stone arches, older than the particular set of laws that had, this morning, been used to place a woman at the worst station in the crescent with the expectation that she would fail. I set the cloak around her shoulders. She looked up at me, surprised, I think, by the gesture's age and its weight, and in her expression I saw, for the first time, something that was not composure. Not performed composure and not real composure. Something younger than all of it, something that had been waiting behind the steadiness. A relief so deep it looked, briefly, almost like grief. The face of someone who has held a great deal for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. I said quietly, "You should have been here years ago." She said, equally quiet, "I tried twice before, they didn't let me enter." I made a note of that. I filed it with precise and absolute intention in the part of my mind that governed the ordering of Valdris, and I did not let my expression change, because this was not the moment for that reckoning, and there would be a moment for it. I said, "You are here now." She said, "Yes." The formal acknowledgement of the mate bond, in Valdris, was a simple thing. The Alpha King spoke it. The pack witnessed it. There was no ceremony required beyond those 2 elements, words and witnesses. The elaborate rituals that some kingdoms built around the claiming were not Valdris's tradition. Valdris was a kingdom that had been built by makers and had the values of makers. A thing was what it was, and it was either true or it was not, and no amount of ceremony made a false thing true. I turned to face the arena. I said in the formal voice, "Valdris witnesses." A pause. "I have found my fated mate. She stands before you. The bond is real, and it is answered, and she is the lunar of this pack." The crowd made a sound that I had not heard before in this arena, not the confirmation of what they had expected. Not the satisfaction of a world remaining in its order. Something more unsteady than that, more various. The sound of 300 people arriving at slightly different moments at a revision of what they thought they knew. Some of them quickly, some of them slowly. Some of them with joy, because wolves respond to the mate bond with joy when they see it. It is not possible to witness the real thing and feel nothing. Some of them with something more complicated, because they had been in the crowd that murmured contempt 2 hours ago, and they now had to hold both of those things at once. In the front tier, the eldest guild master rose from his seat. He was a large man, older than me, with the bearing of someone who had been significant in Valdris for a very long time. He had been guildmaster for 22 years. He had run the trials. He had set the station assignments. He had written her name in the rolls as the 12th entrant with his own hand, in the knowledge that she would be entered, assigned the worst position, and dismissed. He rose from his seat, and he bowed. It was not a small bow, not the half-tilt of acknowledgement, not the formal minimal degree required by protocol. It was a full bow, the kind that bends from the waist, the kind that a man performs when he is trying to express something that he does not have the words for, when the gesture must carry what the voice cannot. His two colleagues on either side of him did the same, a half-second behind, following the lead. The tears followed. Not all at once, not in the sudden collapse of a crowd into obeisance, which is a coerced thing, and this was not. One household, then another, rising. The competitors on the arena floor, two of whom I could see clearly, who had produced good work and knew it, and were witnessing something that had nothing to do with the quality of their work. They rose and they bowed, and in their expressions I read something I recognized from my own chest, the specific feeling of a person who has just seen the standard shift and is recalibrating toward it, rather than away. Beside me she had not moved. She was standing with the gray and black cloak around her shoulders, her ink-stained hands at her sides, watching the arena. She was not watching it with triumph or with satisfaction. She was watching it the way you watch weather from a window, with a kind of removed attention, witnessing rather than claiming. I said to her very quietly, "Are you all right?" She said, "I made the vessel." "Yes. I've been making things like that for 23 years, she said, "and I have never once been allowed into a trial." "I know," I said, "that is going to change." She looked at me, not the not-quite smile this time, something more direct than that. She said, "You mean that?" "I mean everything I say," I told her. "It is a policy I recommend." That got the smile, the real one, the one she had been keeping behind the composure for the duration of the morning. It was not a small thing. Her name was Senna, and she had been born in the lower quarter of Valdris's eastern district, the daughter of a craftsman who worked with hides and a mother who kept the records of a small merchant house. Neither of them had been guild members. Neither of them had had the formal training of the Makers' Guild, the certification of method, the documented apprenticeship that determined who was allowed to enter the annual trials. She had taught herself, since she was 7 years old by her own account, though the evidence suggested she had been making things before she could articulate what she was doing. Her father had found her, at that age, working a scrap of the hide he used in his trade into a small figured form that he could not have produced himself. He had not known what to make of it. He had the practical wisdom to let her continue. She had tried to enter the trials at 19 and been turned away for insufficient documentation. She had tried again at 24 and been turned away again. At 31, the autumn of the year I sat the dais and watched her walk through the arch, the eldest guild master had entered her himself, with documentation he had expedited as a formality, one more entry to fill the required count. He had, it emerged, been shown samples of her work by a lower guild official who had encountered it through a secondary channel and brought it to his attention. He had dismissed it as forgery. He had entered her in the trial, I believe, with the intention of demonstrating that the work he had been shown could not be reproduced under trial conditions, that it had been the product of time and assistance rather than of her own hands. He had been wrong. I learned all of this in the days that followed. I learned it methodically, the way I learned everything that pertained to the governance of Valdris, by asking the right people the right questions and then listening without interjection until they had said everything they had to say. What I learned made me understand, with precision, the weight of what had nearly happened in that arena, and, by extension, what had been happening in the lower quarter of the Eastern District for 23 years, while a woman with hands like that worked alone and entered her name in rolls and was turned away and entered again. I did not use that information for grievance. Grievance was not what the situation required. What it required was correction, careful, structural, named correction that would be visible to the guild families and the pack houses and would make clear without ambiguity what was expected going forward. That is a different matter, and it belongs to my governance of this kingdom, which is a longer story than this one. What belongs to this story is what happened on the evening of the trials. The formal acknowledgement in the arena had been witnessed. The pack would circulate the news, packs always did, and Valdris was no different from any other pack in this regard. By nightfall, the household tables would be carrying the conversation, and by the following morning it would have reached every corner of the kingdom. I was, by this point in my reign, under no illusions about the pace of information in a wolf pack. What I could choose was how the evening proceeded. I brought her to the upper house, not the formal reception rooms, which were too large and too ceremonial for what I wanted to offer, but the smaller rooms above the great hall, the ones with windows that looked out over the lower city and the proving ground below. My housekeeper, a woman named Dara who had managed the upper house since my father's time, and who had seen enough in 40 years to respond to the unexpected with pragmatism rather than alarm, had prepared a meal and a fire without being asked. I did not know whether she had understood, from the reports coming up from the arena, what exactly had happened, or whether she had acted on the general principle that any evening that required the Alpha King to walk to the 12th station and give his formal cloak away was likely to need a good fire and a hot meal. Either way, I was grateful for her. Senna sat across from me in the small room, the cloak still around her shoulders. She had not given it back, and I had not asked for it, with her hands around a cup of something warm, and we talked. Not formally. I had had enough formal conversation for one day, and I thought she had too, and the small room above the great hall was not a formal kind of space. I asked her about the vessel, what she had been thinking, working all three materials, when the expected strategy was to choose one. She said, I knew what they expected me to do. Choose the clay because it was what I was most comfortable with, and produce something small and finished in the clay and leave the rest untouched. That would have been competent. That would have been enough to pass the count. But not enough to be seen, I said. She looked at me steadily. No, not enough to be seen. I asked, were you afraid? A pause, she turned the cup in her hands. I've been making things for 23 years, she said. The fear would have been working small, working safe, making the thing that would pass without surprising anyone. That would have frightened me. The vessel didn't. No, she said. The vessel was what it needed to be. I knew that when I looked at the materials. I knew what they were asking to be together. I just did that. I said, Harwick told me before you began that you would leave the metals. She smiled. He wasn't wrong, that was the sensible choice. You are not sensible, I said. She looked up at me sharply and then understood my tone, and the smile returned more fully than before. No, she said, I don't think I am. We talked for a long time. The fire burned down and Dara came in once to add to it and left without comment. The lower city quieted outside the windows, the lights of the proving grounds brackets guttering one by one as the torches burned out. I learned things about her, not the formal facts, those I could acquire through the correct administrative channels, but the other things. The quality of her attention, the particular way she thought about materials as things with their own intention, their own readiness, their own sense of what they were for. The patience she had developed, not through ease but through the specific patience of someone who has been turned away repeatedly and has had to learn not to mistake delay for denial. I told her things too. I am not a confessional man by nature. I had learned, as a king, to carry what I carried and to keep the shape of it internal. But the small room above the hall had a quality of privacy that the rest of my life rarely offered, and she listened the way she worked, without hurry, without filling the silences, letting what was said settle before adding to it. I told her about the 16 years of the trials and the specific bone-deep weariness of presiding over a system you can see the flaws in and have not yet found the mechanism to correct. I told her about my father, who had built the trial system in its current form and who had believed genuinely that it was fair, because the flaws were invisible from where he sat. I told her about the way a kingdom looks different depending on where you are standing in it, and how the only cure for that is to move. She said at some point in the evening, I thought this morning that the best I could hope for was to be noted, to have the work seen and to be noted, and to be allowed to come back next year under my own documentation. And now, she looked around the room, the fire, the windows, the city below, the empty cups, the long table that had seen this kind of evening before and would see it again. At me. Now I don't know what I thought was possible, she said. I think I was working with a smaller idea of what the day could be. I was too, I said. I sat down on that dais this morning with the expectation that it would be an ordinary trial day. And instead, I said, it was the most significant morning of my reign. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that because of what I made?" "It is because of both," I said. "What you made and who you are, the two are not separable in this case." She looked down at her hands. The ink and the chalk dust. The marks of 23 years of working alone, of entering names in rolls and being turned away and entering again. The hands that had produced the vessel that was still sitting on the stone table at the 12th station, because I had asked that it not be moved until I had spoken with the guild elders in the morning, and the trial master had confirmed that it would be guarded overnight. I said quietly, "May I?" She extended one hand across the table. I took it in both of mine. The bond steadied, that river current certainty, that sense of continuation, and I felt it echo back from her, the same quality, the same direction. I said, "I want you to know something. You are not entering an obligation. You are not being claimed in the sense of being owned or directed or constrained. What I said in the arena today, what the pack witnessed, what that means in Valdris is that I have recognized you as the one the bond named. It means I intend to build the rest of my reign around the fact of that recognition. It means that what you make and what you are will be seen, not as a favor, not as an exception, but as what it always should have been." She was looking at me with the directness that I had first noticed on the arena floor, not performing anything. "Just present," she said, "and what do you want from me?" I said, "What you give freely, nothing else." Another silence. The fire, the city quieting below, her hand in mine, warm and chalk-dusted and completely steady. She said, "I think I can manage that." What followed the autumn trial was not a single moment. It was a series of mornings. The guild elders' formal revision of the trial records, the documentation of Senna's results, and the beginning of the administrative review of entry practices, which I conducted myself over the following weeks with the particular thoroughness that a king applies when he is correcting something he should have seen sooner, and did not. The guild master who had entered her name as a formality was not removed from his position. He was required to appear before the full guild council and to describe, in detail, the basis on which he had made his assessment of the work he had been shown. He was required to do this in front of his colleagues, and in front of the lower guild official who had brought the samples to his attention, and in front of the record keepers. It took most of a morning, and at the end of it, the record keepers had what they needed to revise the entry practices, and the guild master had what he needed to understand what had happened, not because I told him, but because he had had to say it himself in his own words, in front of the people he had expected to confirm his judgment. That is a particular kind of correction, slower than removal, more lasting. The vessel, Senna's vessel, was assessed, eventually, by the guild elders, using a process that took 3 sessions because the standard measures kept running into the problem that the vessel exceeded them. In the end, they did what the guild had not done in 80 years. They created a new category of assessment for work that could not be contained within the existing framework. They named it for the autumn trial, which was a formality I did not request, and which I understood they had done because naming things is what makers do when they are trying to ensure that what happened is not forgotten. Senna found this, as she found most of the formal apparatus of the guild, slightly absurd. She told me so one evening in the small room above the great hall. She said, "They've been assessing work for 200 years, and it took one vessel to make them admit that the measures were too small." I said, 200 years of measures made for the things they expected to see. She said, "And now? Now they will make measures for the things they have seen." She considered this. "That's either progress or it's just new walls," she said. "Perhaps," I said, "we keep going and we find out." She moved into the upper house at the start of winter. Not immediately, not in the days following the trial when things were still in motion, when the formal acknowledgments were still being registered by the pack houses and the guild families were still in the early stages of their revision. She needed time. I did not hurry it. I had, as I had told her, a policy of meaning what I said, and what I had said was that she would have what she gave freely. She gave it in her own time, and her own time was measured and deliberate and entirely her own. What I can tell you about the winter, that she worked. She had a room in the upper house that she converted within the first week into something she could actually use, the formal furniture pushed to the walls, the long table cleared, her cloth bag of tools unpacked for the first time in a non-borrowed space. Dara observed this process with the equanimity she brought to everything and arranged to have additional lighting installed without being asked. I came to her workroom in the evenings sometimes, not always. I had a kingdom to govern, and she had work to do, and the balance between those two realities was something we found together, over the first weeks of winter, the way you find most things of importance. By trial, by adjustment, by learning what the other person needed and being willing to revise your initial assumptions. She was easier to talk to than anyone I had met in 16 years of reign. Not because she agreed with me, she did not often, and when she disagreed she said so with the same direct attention she brought to everything, but because she disagreed as a person engaged with the actual question rather than as a person managing what I would think of them. I had not had that, or not enough of it, in the long years of the Alpha King's particular solitude. The solitude of being the final authority in a room, which means that no one in the room is fully comfortable contradicting you, however much you might want them to. She was comfortable. She was, in fact, constitutionally incapable of performing a comfort she did not feel, which I had established early and which I valued beyond the capacity of formal language to express. One evening in midwinter, she showed me what she was working on. A larger piece, the materials running across the full width of the cleared table. Something that used the same three-material method as the vessel but larger and more complex. The metal threaded through the wood through the clay in a system of relationships that I could see, by then, were not arbitrary. That everything in them was necessary and intentional and would, when finished, produce a whole that could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. She explained it to me in the language she used when she talked about her work, the language of attention and necessity, of what the materials asked for and what she was trying to give back to them. I am not a maker. I did not understand all of it. But I understood the quality of mind behind it, and that quality was one I had encountered only a handful of times in 42 years. The kind of intelligence that is not separate from what it is doing, that does not stand to the side of the work and assess it, but is continuous with it, embedded in it, so that the thinking and the making are the same act. I told her that. She looked at me sidelong. "You say things like that," she said, "and then you go and govern a kingdom. Is that a contradiction?" "No," she said. She considered it. "No, I don't think it is. I just wasn't expecting it." "What were you expecting?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the work on the table, the long, complex thing that would take the rest of the winter at her pace, which was the right pace and not a moment faster. Then she looked at me. "I think I was expecting to be acknowledged," she said, "to have the work recognized, to be given space, room, the basic things that had been withheld." A pause. "I was not expecting to be known." I said, "And now?" She looked at me for a long moment, in the lamplit workroom, with the winter outside the windows and the work on the table between us and the bond steady in my chest. That river current certainty, that sense of continuation. She said, "Now I think the vessel was only the beginning." We were wed in the spring. Not in the proving ground. I had considered it, and Senna had said, when I floated the idea, that she had had enough of that arena for one lifetime, which I thought was reasonable. We were wed in the great hall of the upper house, with the pack assembled in the tiers above and the doors open to the courtyard below, where the first light of the spring morning came in at an angle and lay across the stone floor in long, pale rectangles. She wore gray, not the unmarked gray of an entrant without house colors, but a deep, particular gray that she had chosen herself. Dara had accompanied her to the clothier, and had, I was told, said very little, because Senna had known what she wanted and had needed very little input. The only mark of the Luna's formal dress was the clasp at the collar, which was, she had made it herself, in the workroom, over 2 evenings in the final week before the wedding, and she had not shown me until the morning. It was small, the size of a thumb, perhaps. Metal and wood and the pale clay, the same 3 materials, the same 3-into-1 construction. A figured form that I could not fully read at first, and then could, the way you finally see the image in a pattern. 2 marks, the old script of Valdris, the mate bond written in the same hand. I looked at it for a long time, at the collar of her gray dress, in the morning light of the great hall. She said, "Too much." I said, "No." After, in the long afternoon when the pack had been fed and the formal acknowledgments had been registered and the hall was beginning to empty, she and I stood for a while at the window above the courtyard, watching the light change on the stone below. The cloak, the gray and black, the one I had put around her shoulders in the arena 8 months ago, was folded on the windowsill. She had kept it through the winter. She had told me early on that she intended to keep it, and I had told her it was hers. I looked at her in the afternoon light, at the clasp she had made, at the marks it carried, at her chalk-dusted hands, which were always chalk-dusted, even on the day of her wedding, because she had spent the morning in the workroom and had not entirely managed to clean them. I thought about the morning of the autumn trial, the moment she walked through the arch, the stillness behind my ribs, the door on its hinges, the river finding its direction, the thing I had not had a name for 42 years. I had no great speech for it. That was not my way, and she would not have wanted one. I said, I have been Alpha King of Valdris for 16 years. I have governed the trials and the guild and the pack houses and the mechanisms of the kingdom, and I have done those things as well as I knew how. But I think I have been waiting for a standard I did not know how to name. She looked at me steady, the real thing. And now, she said. I looked at the clasp at her collar, at the two marks together, written in the same hand, small enough to hold in a palm and true enough to be unmistakable. Now, I said, I know what it looks like. She turned her hand palm up on the windowsill, the chalk-dusted one, the left one, the one that carried the mark. I set mine beside it. The two marks, a hand's width apart in the long spring light. And Valdris stretched out below us, quiet and particular and full of mornings we had not yet had.